Hi everyone, welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, September 28th. And what we are doing is closing in on the textbook, believe it or not. And hopefully the textbook information is of use to you when you are putting together not only your first speech, which is coming up, but the following speeches over the course of the semester and any speeches you might be giving in the future. So, the three chapters that I have assigned for today are Chapter 10, Delivering Your Speech, Chapter 4, which happens to be about culture, and lastly, Chapter 5, about audience. So, in terms of delivering speeches, what we've been focusing on in this class is the extemporaneous speech. It's a speech that is prepared in advance and it's delivered with a speaking outline. A speaking outline being key words and phrases, almost like the notes below the videos that I post. In fact, this is literally my speaking outline. I'm having the paper version as my guide, just in case there are any kind of mechanical failures. But I use keywords and phrases, as you can see, and it's easy to skim. Certainly, it wouldn't be something that's written out like a paper. So you wouldn't be reading a paper to the camera because you have to think about maintaining eye contact with the camera. You have to think about body language, and you have to think about being conversational. So that's the kind of speech that we are doing, but there are other kinds of speeches. There is indeed a memorized speech. That's usually done for highly formal events, and it also is usually quite short. Think about something like the toast at a wedding. And the reason why is because the longer the speech is, the more difficult it is to memorize it correctly, and the greater the likelihood of making an error. There are also what are known as impromptu speeches. Those are speeches that are done basically quote on the fly, unquote. No preparation whatsoever. And the idea behind the impromptu speech is that you weren't given any kind of advance warning. Let's say something to the effect of you're being surprised with an award. And of course, what I suggest you do is to keep it short and simple so there's less likelihood that you can become entangled in your words or your thoughts. You don't want to give an impromptu speech when you've had a chance to prepare because you want your speech to be much more polished than that. But again, you don't want to have a manuscript speech, which is a speech that you read word for word. There are a few situations where that might be appropriate. Academic conferences, for instance, scholars oftentimes will read papers. Take about televised broadcasts where everything has to be timed to the second. So chances are that you've got a newscaster, for instance, who's reading off of a teleprompter. Now, I've never had the opportunity to use a teleprompter, but I can tell you that reading off a teleprompter is a skill in and of itself, because you still want to seem natural when you're looking at the camera or looking at your audience or both. And in fact, if you'll see in the notes below, I have a brief video for you to watch about a teleprompter fail. It was a mechanical error, and it goes to show how you don't want to rely too much on your technology, including teleprompters. And this happened to Michael Bay, a very famous movie director, talking about his latest film. So obviously it was a subject that he was well versed in, and what we can see is that very soon he becomes flustered because the teleprompter is not acting correctly. And in the end, he actually runs off stage. And you certainly don't want to be in that kind of position. So it's unfortunate that he needed the teleprompter so badly that he couldn't continue on with what he was doing. So I always use that as an example of even having a written speech in front of you, that doesn't necessarily make the exercise foolproof. And then in terms of thinking about the actual delivery, you want to think about your voice. Part of this is going to be dependent on your equipment. You want to make sure that your volume is loud enough to hear. Certainly you want to test it and make sure that all of the glitches are out of your recordings. You want to vary your volume as much as possible. You don't want to be a monotone. So thinking about things like varying your speed, varying your vocal inflections, and varying your volume will keep your audience's attention. And you want to make sure that you are enunciating, This is different than pronunciating. Enunciating is forming the words clearly. You want to avoid mumbling. And people oftentimes mumble when they're either insecure or they're not certain of what they're going to say, or perhaps English is not their primary language, but you want to speak clearly enough so that we can hear you. And that's different from pronunciation, which is how you actually accent a particular word. And there are Romance languages such as Spanish and French that actually use accent marks to give you a hint or a clue as to what part of the word you should emphasize. There are other languages like English that don't do that. But you can think about the difference between Bernardston or Berniston. Something I still struggle with is just putting the accent in the right place. And the reason why I struggle with it is because I'm not native to the area. I suspect I wouldn't have these difficulties if I was native to the area. However, there are other things that perhaps we universally have dispute over. Is it Caribbean or Caribbean, for instance? Is it harassment or harassment? It's about where you're putting the accent. And I can say that my husband likes to tease me because I'm originally from New York City. So occasionally my New York accent will come out when I'm asking for coffee or talking about going to the mall with the aw sound. Again, the idea is that an accent or your pronunciation is not going to change overnight, and you shouldn't try to change it unless you're in a situation such as being a media broadcaster where you need to do so for professional reasons. You just want to make sure that you speak clearly enough so that we can understand. And if you happen to be somewhat self-conscious about your pronunciation, you might even want to tell us at the beginning of the speech that, for instance, English is not your first language. So that puts the burden of responsibility on us as audience to listen more carefully. So the same would happen, let's say, if you're having laryngitis and you couldn't speak as loud as you normally would, by telling us that at the beginning of the speech, that puts the burden on us to listen a little bit more carefully than we normally would. You can see in the notes below, I talked about proxemics. It's one of the terms that's introduced in our textbook. It sounds like the word proximity, and for good reason, because it's about the use of space. And this is a discipline in and of itself. And certainly how you use space influences on how you deliver a speech and how an audience responds to a speech. Again, we're not necessarily delivering to a live audience, but thinking about, do you want to connect with your audience? If so, you probably want to be closer to them. If you have a larger audience, you probably want to be farther away. Even something like a furniture arrangement in a classroom, whether they be arranged in chair or in rows or in circles, can influence how an audience responds. This also works with body language, and particularly with comfort levels for physical distance and personal space. If you've ever seen what I call the dance, where you have two people who may not even be consciously aware that they have different comfort levels with personal space. One person needs more personal space, the other needs less personal space. And as they're speaking to one another, they're constantly shifting back and forth. The reason why is because the person who wants more physical space is feeling uncomfortable, so they continually step backwards. And the person who wants less physical space is also continually uncomfortable, and they keep stepping forward. And basically, it's almost as if they're dancing around the room, because the location they start in with their conversation is not the conversation, it's not the ending point of their particular conversation. They've moved quite a bit along the room. So even something as simple as that can influence a message and how it's communicated. There's something called affect display. That's an A with an affect. And this is called emotional response. And we usually read someone's affect through their facial expressions. And it's one of the reasons why it's important that your audience see your face, Particularly if you are recording, you want to make sure that we can actually see your facial expressions. Whether you decide to record yourself full body, or you can see that what I've done is half body, but I am trying to maintain eye contact with the camera, and also I am making sure that you've got a good view of my face so that you can gauge things like eye contact and facial expressions. So we oftentimes talk about how if somebody doesn't have any affect, that means that they're not showing any facial expressions. An interesting study actually was done about individuals who have great difficulty with social relationships. And no, that's not you if you think that's you. People who really can't function in the day-to-day world with school and work and so forth. And they were given an experiment, an exercise to perform. They were shown photos of facial expressions, and facial expressions tend to be fairly universal, so that a smile usually denotes happiness. Though, of course, you can have such a thing as a sad smile, and a frown usually denotes unhappiness. Well, these individuals who have difficulty with personal relationships and with social relationships and navigating the social world were misidentifying these facial expressions, that they identified a smile as sadness and a frown as happiness. And I think this can help explain why they're having difficulty negotiating social relationships if they're misreading all of these cues. So affect display is very important. Gestures can be very important as well. There are conventional gestures, and they're called that because they are assigned meaning by convention. They don't necessarily have to have a particular meaning, but they could have a particular meaning based on what our culture, and I'm going to talk about culture in a few minutes, that was one of the chapters that we've talked about, has dictated. The OK sign is a great example. In other cultures, it's viewed as offensive, actually. Not in America, however. There are descriptive gestures that do just that. They describe size and shape. That's much more universal. And then there are indicators, gestures that can indicate or show emotion. For instance, slamming a fist on a table to emphasize a point. Again, with the limitations of recording, you may or may not be able to illustrate gestures, but you certainly want to avoid extremes. You don't want to come off as seeming too stiff that you're just not moving, or pacing back and forth, as the Toastmaster video had discussed as well. So you want to pay careful attention to what's visible on the camera. In terms of eye contact, usually what we suggest is that you vary that across audience members, and that you look to the left, you look to the middle, you look to the right, and that if you feel uncomfortable doing that, you can look at the sides of the room and the middle of the room, so that you're not necessarily looking at a particular person, or you could look at the top of their heads, and it appears as if you're engaging the audience. Again, it's going to be somewhat different now that we are recording. Your audience is the camera, so you want to look straight on into the camera. Now, eye contact is also variable. Some cultures, and as I said, I'll talk about cultures in a moment, view eye contact as a positive thing. It shows engagement. That's certainly true in the United States. Other cultures, such as Asian cultures, for instance, might view eye contact as somewhat offensive, that maintaining or not maintaining eye contact is a way to show deference and respect. So you need to be able to understand how to decipher people's body language as well. So, going to culture, which is in chapter 4, I suppose the broadest definition of the term is any group membership. And we can debate whether or not two people are a group or just a pair, but certainly 3 or more is a group. And the reason why we talk about it in terms of any group membership is because a group can develop a personality. And it does, just like an individual has a personality. And there is a predictive element to the personality which the group develops. And some of the things that are influenced by that group membership include behaviors. Those are actions that can be visibly seen. So more often than not, those are easier to identify than something like, let's say, an attitude, an emotional response. And emotional responses can be something that vary from moment to moment, or it could be something that is much more long-lived. If anybody's ever told you that you have a bad attitude, for instance, about something, then that's not necessarily just in the moment. Or again, it would depend on the context of how the person used it. And then you have things like beliefs, things that you think are true or things that you think are false. And again, that could be influenced by your group membership. But there always is room for individual variance. We don't want to stereotype, which is to overgeneralize. And then values. Values are usually firmly embedded and they include everything: beliefs, attitudes, behaviors, all of it. And this will be particularly important with our third speech, which is a persuasive speech, where you're going to try to convince your audience to take a position or perhaps to take an action or both. Because some people's values are so firmly embedded, it doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter what you do. They are never changing their minds. And that should not be the criteria that we're using to evaluate the effectiveness of the speech. What we want to do is earn our audience's respect, that an audience member can say, that was a good speech. I completely disagree with your position, but it was a good speech. So this goes all the way back to things like being ethical and being prepared and all of the rest. Excuse me. So thinking about how culture can influence things like communication. There's some cultures that are much more direct. There are other cultures which are much more long-winded. And knowing your culture for your audience can be very useful so that you can adapt your speech to your audience. Ultimately, the speaker wants to adapt to the audience. The audience shouldn't have to adapt to the speaker. But again, we belong to multitudes of culture. Usually we talk about these large demographic groups, groups with observable characteristics. Things like age, for instance, though you can't always be accurate with your prediction of age. But there are other categories that are not as broad as age or gender or ethnicity. So any kind of group membership. So college students, that's a culture, that they have a certain number of behaviors that are rather predictable, even though there are individuals that can vary. And they have certain beliefs and they have certain attitudes and they have certain values. So this sort of helps me if I know who is my culture and my audience. Thing is, again, we belong to dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of different cultures. But there is that predictive element, and it could be as small as our own class, for better or worse, is a culture. A group of individuals who basically have some predictive elements associated with them. I can't guarantee this is the case for everyone in the class, but I would suggest that many of you value education, because if you didn't, perhaps even the bulk of you value education, then why would you be watching this video and why would you be taking this class? And again, there could be other reasons and other motivators, but I'm fairly certain that that's somewhat predictable for college students, just as it's somewhat predictable that the cost of textbooks are too high. That's how most college students respond to the cost of textbooks. Not every, but many, maybe even most, myself included when I was a college student. So as much as things have changed over the years, they've also remained the same. So, as I was indicating, the idea that we belong to multiple cultures. We talk about the United States and multicultural, multi being more than one. And we are, of course, a melting pot, though I prefer using the term stew of different cultures. Melting pot assumes that everyone is going to assimilate. I like the idea of the stew or the soup where everyone maintains individual difference, but all of the contributions as a whole, they basically improve the whole. So this sense of demographics, looking at these observable characteristics, this is also a discipline in and of itself, particularly if you go into media where you're trying to determine who your demographics are, who your audience is, and what is the best way to market your product to that particular audience, whether it be the piece of entertainment or whether it be the product that's being sold in the commercial for that or during that piece of entertainment, or a combination of the two. So things like, and you can see this in the notes below under the third section for demographics: age, gender, ethnic background, education, political affiliation, religion, and again, some are more obvious than others. certainly what we've seen with the advent of the internet is that media can target very specific demographic groups in a way that television, which really was the predominant media prior to the internet, couldn't do. It was geared towards a much more general audience. The best comparison I can think of would be magazines. That prior to the internet, it was magazines that were usually geared towards very specialized interests. For instance, magazines for people who were hobby enthusiasts of crochet. Again, very specific demographic group. And again, that is a culture with beliefs and values, attitudes, behaviors. Now, the textbook talks a little bit about what to do if you encounter a hostile audience. I doubt you will ever be in this situation. Usually, the speaker is well aware that they're walking into a hostile audience. Something like a politician that is speaking to the opposing party knows that the audience is going to be hostile. However, what you might encounter is a skeptical audience. And I don't have a magic bullet. I can't tell you that if you do ABC, everything is going to be fine. The textbook can't do that either. But there are some suggestions that the textbook talks about that I think can be quite useful when you are working with a skeptical or perhaps hostile audience. And some of the suggestions are: first, establish goodwill. The idea that, no one has ill intent. Secondly, establish areas of agreement. Usually people focus on what they disagree about. If we can focus on what we agree about, at least we have some commonality. Use credible outside sources. Not just outside sources. Outside sources can increase your credibility, which is why you will be using them for your third speech. But they need to be credible. And going into the open internet can be dangerous because you may or may not necessarily be accessing credible sources. So we'll talk a little bit more about this as the semester progresses, about perhaps better ways of finding credible resources than going on the open internet. Be professional. And the idea is that your audience may not necessarily agree with you, but at least they can respect the fact that you put time and effort and you were professional and appropriate in terms of your presentation. Use humor, though humor can be tricky because humor can be influenced by culture. What's funny to one group may not necessarily be funny to another. But humor, laughter is a great way to bring people together. And be multi-sided. Or what I call, not avoiding the elephant in the room, that sometimes people try so hard to support their particular position that they act as if no other position exists. And better to at least acknowledge, albeit briefly, you don't want to lose control of your speech and start talking about other positions, but at least acknowledge that there are other ways, there are other viewpoints of considering the issue. And if you can refute that, if you can briefly talk about why those are not as effective as what you're suggesting, you're going to end up with a better speech. And honestly, sometimes people just want to be acknowledged. They just want to hear that, yes, there are other ways of doing things and viewing things. They don't even necessarily want you to agree with the way they do it or with the way they view it. They just want you to acknowledge that they exist. So that can go a long way in terms of working with skeptical audiences. Or if you're ever in a position where you're in a hostile audience. But in terms of these 3 chapters, delivering your speech, which again, you have to think about some of the ways that delivering to a camera would be different than delivering to a live audience. Culture, and how the members of your audience probably belong to multitudes of cultures, but knowing something about your audience, and if nothing else, your audience is made up of college students, so that in and of itself is, and also adults, because we assume that if you're working with a college audience, you're working with adults. Regardless of the student's age, they are treated as if they are adults. That gives you some information about how to proceed or not proceed with the way that you would present your information. Obviously, if you were speaking to a group of children, let's say, you would probably present yourself and the information you're sharing quite differently. And I know that this idea, too, of demographics is particularly complex, but I want you to just be aware of who your audience is. As I give you an assignment, and you can see this in section 4 of the notes, to watch 3 sample autobiographical speeches. Now, these were speeches that were done by students like yourselves, but they're in no way affiliated with GCC, so you don't have to worry that one day you're going to end up being used as a case study. And these speeches are all quite different, and they might perhaps inspire you on how to proceed with your own speech, or how not to proceed with your own speech, whatever the case may happen to be. Now, we can't necessarily evaluate these speeches for things such as length, because they were given under different context and different criteria. We know your length. It's supposed to be about 5 minutes or so. And of course, you've got a little wiggle room on either end, but the longer the speech, the more wiggle room you have. If you're 5 minutes over in a 5-minute speech, that's not good, because you're over twice the amount. If you're 5 minutes over an hour speech, then that's a little bit more acceptable. So I would say maybe 30, 40 seconds on either end of the 5 minutes. And keep in mind that this is not a class in editing. You're not editing lots of different speeches so that you've got it down to the second. This is the one take only kind of speech, much like what I'm delivering right now to you. No, it's not perfect, but the idea is that you have a certain comfort level with being able to articulate your points and with speaking to a camera. So that's what we're working on now. And integrating many of the techniques that the textbook had suggested that could be useful to you when you are presenting a speech. So while we can't necessarily evaluate these speeches on length, we can evaluate them in terms of things like content. And you can see that all 3 speeches are very different from one another. The first speech is taking place in a military environment, and that's a culture in and of itself, and that's going to influence the presentation of it. The second speech looks like it was filmed in a private residence, probably for an online class, though I don't know that. And the third speech, you can see, was filmed in a classroom setting. So again, we have very different environments, but you'll see that they all went about it in different ways to try to teach the audience something about themselves, which is the whole point of the autobiographical speech, your first speech. That at the ending of your speech, we should know more about you, whether you want to give a holistic view of your life, and that means you're obviously going to have to condense. You can't put decades worth of life in 5 minutes. Certainly you're going to have to pick and choose. Or perhaps you want to focus on a particular time period of your life. Or perhaps you want to focus on a particular element of your life and how that element is important for us understanding you. And you can decide how much or how little you want to self-disclose. One of the things that I suggest to students who feel a little bit uncomfortable self-disclosing is that you might want to talk about education, because it's the thing we all share, whether it's your educational history, or it could be your educational present while you're in this class, or your educational goals for the future. But at any rate, each of these speeches are rather short, and I'm going to ask you to view them, and that's going to be today's attendance question, where I am going to ask you on our discussion form to list one strength and one weakness for each speech. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, though I encourage you to. As if you were in class, you could certainly raise your hand. But you are required to read your classmates' responses, and my responses in turn. Yes, I do read everything, and I will be responding in turn. And by reading all of that, you would get a sense of what it is that we would be talking about in a class discussion if we were having a face-to-face class. So where are we now? Our next class, which is October 5th. Hard to believe that we're moving into October, I know. There's going to be a quiz, our first quiz, and it's going to be on some of the earlier pieces of information that were covered in the textbook, and also pieces of information covered in the class videos. It's an open book, open note quiz, so you can utilize things like your notes and so forth. And it will be 20 questions. Be mostly short answer, but it'll also be some perhaps true, false, or multiple choice. and I'm hopeful that the questions are more than just questions to ensure that you've been watching the videos and that you've been doing the reading, but that also the questions are questions that will be helpful to you when you are putting together any speech, basically, but especially the first speech. And the first speech is scheduled for the 12th of October. So you should be in the midst of preparing for that first speech. So next class, in addition to the quiz, basically your assignment is to work on your speech. And at some point between now, this very moment, but before the 12th of October, before you actually have to upload your speech, you should schedule some sort of practice consultation with me. It could be as simple as just an email exchange telling me what you're planning on writing about. You could send me a draft syllabus, or a draft speaking outline. You can even set up a Zoom appointment or a phone appointment with me if you wanted to, and actually deliver your speech and get my feedback. So I do want to consult with all of you, but how much or how little I consult with you is determined by you, not determined by me. But the idea is that I'm aware of what it is that you're doing with your first speech. So my thought was that most of you would do that around the time your first speech is due. That's where I've got it scheduled on the syllabus, but or actually right before the first speech is due, that you would do it when your first quiz is due, actually, is what I wanted to say, next week. But that's when it's scheduled on your syllabus, that you would do a practice consultation around the same time you would do your first quiz. But the sooner the better, obviously, for everybody involved, just as long as it's before the 12th, because the 12th is the actual date in which you will be uploading. So what I will do next class, in addition to posting the quiz, is I will also post instructions on how to upload your speech. What I will be doing is adding a folder onto our Moodle site around the date that your first speech is due, and then basically you can upload that speech. IT recommends that you use YouTube, and I'll give you those instructions. I actually use YouTube. That's how I upload these videos. However, IT has also given me another way to upload speeches directly through Moodle and bypassing YouTube. So I'll also give you those directions as well. I personally have not done that, but it's something you could do. So that said, you want to make sure that you're working out technological glitches. You want to make sure that when you post your speech on YouTube, that it is something that can be viewed, because not only do I need to see it, but your classmates eventually will need to see it, because one of the assignments that will be coming up after you've posted your speech, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the future, is that you are to watch your classmates' speeches and to send me privately a strength and a weakness so I can compile all that data and then share it with the class. But that would be done on a private level. What we are doing with the practice speeches, because none of us are involved in the practice speeches, you can do that on the discussion forum so everyone can see. But again, your discussion forum response, which is due Saturday, the 29th of September. Though if you need additional time, please let me know. I can grant you an extension. Please list one strength and one weakness from each of the 3 sample autobiographical speeches, and you can see those below in the notes. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.